Memory. GI Gurdjieff, when speaking of the first conscious shock, said that man should remember himself as he was born to be able to. If you ask what the work is about at this stage, it is about self-remembering. At this place in the 3 octaves, something is missing in the present state of humanity. Therefore, it is necessary now to give the shock of self-remembering, which should be given naturally. The trouble is, though, that even when people begin to understand what self-remembering means, they forget to remember themselves. It is necessary to create memory space dedicated to self-remembering, and for this reason, we must create many alarm clocks in order to begin to awaken, because people may wish to remember themselves, but forget to remember that they need to remember themselves. Gurdjieff went on to speak about the different kinds of memory that we possess, and in his earlier teaching with P.D. Ouspensky in France, it was explained that we must try to observe different kinds of memory at work within ourselves. He said that each center, each part of a center, and each subdivision of that center has its own particular kind of memory. Remember that we have 3 centers, each divided into an emotional, a thinking, and a movement part, and then they in turn are further divided into a positive, a negative, and a neutral subdivision. This means that each eye has its own memory, because eyes are arranged in a certain order, occupying those different parts of centers. We have, for example, very trivial memories that really belong to small eyes in small parts of centers. We remember how we lost an action figure or misplaced a comic book years ago, and so on. Ouspensky confirmed that all memories are necessary to terraform our time bodies. However, he spoke too about the education of memory, saying that if we can only remember very small things, then we fail to remember the big things. It's a woods and tree situation. If we always live in small eyes, then we cannot, for example, remember this work. He cautioned that every part of a center is useful, except the negative part of emotional center. The negative part of emotional center is unfortunately divided into smaller and bigger parts, just as every other part of a center is. The bigger or more internal part of the negative part of emotional center is capable of remembering insults all of one's life. This is not trivial memory. On the contrary, such deep negative emotions make an individual wait for years to take their revenge. The reason why it is more persistent is because it lies in bigger eyes, in the negative parts of our emotional center. Small eyes tend to forget. Bigger eyes remember more persistently. Some people, unfortunately, have very deep-seated negative memory that destroys their lives, such as childhood or generational trauma stemming from abuse. We all know examples of those who say they will never forgive or forget. It is curious how they take a certain pride in saying that, as if it renders their cause noble. However, in reality it forms a deep ulcer in them that will always bind them to life, to suffering, and hold them back in entanglement, preventing any new way of thinking or feeling. Examining then different kinds of memory, since every center, and every part of a center, each subdivision of that center has a different kind of memory, then we can expect to observe different kinds of memory at work in different parts of our lives. For example, some people have a very good memory for tunes, but cannot remember the words of that song, whereas some people can remember the words but not the tune. Here obviously are 2 different kinds of memory at work. Some may remember ordinary tunes, and some may remember entire operas. These again are different memories, of which we might say that those who remember ordinary tunes remember in a smaller part of a center, whereas those that remember whole operas remember in a bigger part. Some people remember figures very well, impersonally or personally. They remember impersonal things like the national debt, or more personally, the rate of interest on some investment, still more personally, the fares on the train or bus to somewhere. They figure out things and calculate constantly, which is a quite different memory from mathematical calculation, or from higher mathematics. It is connected, but mathematics resides in a higher part of the center. A capacity for figuring we might put into the formatory center, but a capacity for mathematics must be placed in at least the emotional part of an intellectual center. The capacity for higher mathematics probably in the intellectual part of intellectual center. Some people have a very good memory for faces, probably with no names attached. On the other hand, others may remember names very well. You may have a very good memory for what has happened in your life with regard to purely external events, whereas other people do not have this memory clearly, but remember their psychological states, how they felt during a certain incident, what they thought. Some people cannot remember a book, but can remember the ideas contained in it, and so on. Sometimes we encounter very highly developed forms of memory, as in youthful prodigies who can remember, let's say, a whole column of the newspaper read out to them once, or who have an extraordinary memory for historical dates. Generally speaking, photographic memory of this limited type is a bad sign, because it becomes the precocious development of one small part of a center at the expense of the development of all the other parts. There are many examples of different kinds of memory, where we can examine our own lives and see when our memory is good and where it is bad. All memories have their uses. The main point, however, is to realize there are many different kinds of memory, and that these different kinds have in turn their different qualities. P.D. Ouspensky once said that some people take pleasure in saying they are absent-minded, like the professor who always forgets his umbrella. He was speaking of the idea of balanced man, in whom all centers work equally, as opposed to one-sided man or small-part man. He said that it would be necessary, if this professor came into the work, for him to learn never to forget his umbrella, because it meant that there was something missing in him which lay at the root cause. In using these different kinds of memory, we realize first that there are different kinds of memory, and that we should be able to call them up when necessary. For example, I may not remember a great many things at this moment, but I should be able to remember when called upon to do so. Memory does not mean always remembering everything, such as what bus to catch, how to cook a goose, how to add up the prices in your shopping cart, how to drive a car, what you read last year or what you learnt at school. Memory is something we call upon at the appropriate moment. An individual with a good memory means a person who has a viable available memory, which can be called upon at the right time. It does not mean an individual who is able to remember everything all at once. At this moment, for instance, I do not remember my memory. It may so happen that I am thinking of nothing, and therefore remembering nothing. If some small parrot says, "You do not remember anything," and how extraordinary it is that so many little mechanical eyes tempt us in this manner, then one should learn not to heed them. Attention always means a use of force, so quite simply don't feed the critters. For this reason, memory can be compared with a great library, or to use a work expression, with a great number of servers, all arranged in a certain way within a data center. Our centers are stacked with these media storage units of every kind, and when we remember, one of those disks or one of those processors turns and responds to us. In this multimedia library of ours, a person with a good memory knows in which archive, folder or subfolder they can find what they want. We all know the state in which we feel that we could remember something, but cannot for the moment. Later it will come to us when we perhaps least expect it to. This means that we must find the way to enter that particular archive, then go to the right department and right level, because memory is on different floors. Ergo there is higher memory and lower memory. So memory in general is like a library. This library is divided into many floors and various departments. Someone with a good memory knows in which department, on which floor, and the shelf on which they can find the book that they want. This may take a little time, but if we have taken in impressions to a certain extent consciously, then we will be able to find the book that we need eventually. If, however, we have taken in those impressions mechanically, without any interest or affection, without any feeling associated with them, then we will not be able to find the way in this library of ours, although, curiously enough, the library is arranged quite correctly. What arranges the library? It is best to answer by saying that this library is arranged, however we are deranged with regard to it, just as all our centers and parts of centers are there already, and arranged in the correct order. So is all our life recorded and arranged in the right order within us, forming our time body, but we are not in contact with it. At the moment of death, we sometimes remember everything, see everything, know everything, see life flashing before our eyes, traversing the timescape in that instant, and realizing what it has all amounted to. For it is all there in our time body, both rightly arranged and wrongly arranged. We just fail to rise above and see it in its completeness. When we have moments of awakening, we see how things are rightly arranged, and how wrongly we are identified with certain things that are not important. Unless things were rightly arranged, we could not see this, we would not know that we had misfiled them. We are not speaking here of great memory, of fully conscious memory, of the book of life that is opened at death. When it is opened, everything is right there in its right form and order. From the moment of that first spark in our first creation, through all levels and all incarnations of being, and from that we are judged, by ourselves. Taking then, emotional memory. Emotional memory can be divided into the memory belonging to the negative part, and the memory belonging to the non-negative part of emotional center. I have often thought that this is one of the most striking examples of our different kinds of memory. Because when we are negative with a person, it is extraordinary how unpleasant and apparently long-forgotten things present themselves in the sphere of our consciousness, wishing to escape and have life through our mouths. Even things that we really thought were over and done with a long time ago. On the other hand, when we become sane again, we cannot understand how we behaved such as we did. We feel quite contrary feelings which often take a stupidly exaggerated form, expressing themselves in quite useless sentiment, which of course makes it much easier for us to be negative again, as we feel that we have quite rightly justified ourselves. But it is only false personality that has justified itself. The remedy for this is either to see the same things in yourself, through self-knowledge, or to bring together consciously all that you know about the good side of a person, then confront your negative feelings with that logic. We always seem to see people either one way or another, and this is the case even with people who have a picture of themselves as being extremely tolerant. These two kinds of memory in our emotional center should become a matter of continual conscious experience for all of us. Never believe in your negative states and in their memories, because they are always wrong, as they are one-sided. Remember too that with such memories, if they become active and control us, we destroy our own development, because no one can develop through negative emotions and those associated memories. They have to be let go without argument, just as you let go of a thing that has a bad smell. This purification of our emotional center and its memories is very difficult, and long work on self is necessary. But if we keep the ideas of the work clearly before us, remembering that negative emotion can only breed negative emotion, if we remember that violence can only create further violence, remember that nothing real can ever grow in negative parts of emotional center, nothing except lies and falsehood, of course. If we remember that no one can reach even a trace of real I if they are venomous, full of hatred, self-pity, spite, vitriol and depression, then perhaps very gradually, keeping all of these things in mind as well as the whole idea of the work, we should be able to experience shorter negative states. This is the dross that has to be cleared away before anything else can happen, the dirty mind that has to be changed. But first one has to observe one's negative states, and we often find people who assure us they are never really negative, even those who all the while are enjoying their negative emotions to the fullest extent. P.D. Ouspensky, when talking about false schools where rules are given that are impossible to keep, said, "It is quite easy to say in a school that people have no right to be negative, but saying that means that we all can do things." Someone who under all circumstances does not become negative is already conscious. It is better to phrase that a little differently and say that we have a right not to be negative. If you are foolishly sincere, simply expressing your negative thoughts and feelings openly in every situation, then you are not being a sly man. One can always plunge into any situation with all our ordinary negative ways of taking it. What we have to learn in this work is to take situations in a more conscious manner, so that we get through them without becoming completely identified. We identify with our negative states very easily, so here we have to remember ourselves, and to remember what the work is teaching us. We have to remember that we need to endeavor not to react mechanically, to try to think what it means to be cleverly sincere. To be cleverly sincere, we must be sincere to our understanding of this work. This can help a great deal, and is where memory can be consciously applied. I must remember myself in this situation. This is an example of work on oneself. It is not the same as being cautious or wary in a life sense, and has quite different origin. Being cautious in a life sense is going with your mechanicalness. We are mechanically cautious, however, the example shared is about acting consciously against our mechanicalness, against oneself. With regard to memory in the moving center, or muscle memory, here lie all kinds of extraordinary memories. Memory for walking, for skating, for writing, for speaking, for balancing, for cycling, for eating, for sewing, for knitting, for doing everything with our hands and with our feet. These memories are acquired, but some are innate and born, such as the memory for sucking. The work teaches that centers are born blank like smooth wax, and are impressed upon by impressions from life. The great exception is, of course, our instinctive center, which is fully developed at birth, as otherwise digestion and breathing, all the many internal functions that occur throughout our lives would have to be learnt. Our instinctive center attends to the inner work of the organism, and is itself a representation of the organic life cosmos in humanity, or what is ordinarily called nature. The cleverness of this center is beyond all computation. It is a 10,000 times better chemist than any actual chemist or physiologist. Without this starting point, mankind would not exist on Earth. We are given this first of all, and a nominal development of moving center, but little else. This is not strictly correct in every sense though, because we are also given higher centers, fully developed, that are always at work in us. But we are not in contact with them, as they represent higher cosmoses in man. In the instinctive center lie memories of sensation. Some people say they can recall their sensations, which may be true, but from my own observation I do not remember an actual sensation, but something disembodied. For example, if I say to you, what is the difference between eating strawberries and plunging into ice-cold water, you will know the difference, but the sensations are disembodied and ghost-like. When you are eating something that gives you a particular sensation of taste, smell, or consistency, you are reminded of other similar sensations by association. This is memory of sensations. Or when you eat a thing said to be chicken and it is not, you know it is not chicken. This means there is memory for different sensations, but I do not think this memory is easily recalled voluntarily. Sensation works in the present moment only, just as all of our senses do. Thought, for example, is different. You can recall the memory of a thought you had yesterday, but I would say you cannot recall in the same way a sensation. Thought is independent of the senses, which only work in the present moment of time, in fact making the present moment in time. However, some trains of thought are timeless, and we have to come back to our senses to know what time it is. If one could recall sensations in their totality, then we would never move away from agreeable sensations. But in recollection they are very thin. People forget their sensations, such as those due to sickness, very easily. If you could recall fully the sensation of being warm, then you would never be cold. Certainly it is possible to create warmth, and some yogi schools teach this first of all, but it is done through the mind, and not through recall. Looking then at the connection between memory and association. With regard to this enormous subject, we must remember that all associations are connected with memory. The lowest level is automatic. The highest level is through corresponding ideas. Say you swing your arm around, then suddenly begin to talk about baseball or cricket, how you used to bowl or pitch for your team. You do not know why you talk about cricket, but the movement, as it were, triggers memories of cricket. This is automatic. This side of our life is constantly at work. Only we do not notice it. For example, if you sit in a certain position, you may become negative. This is because you have been negative before when sitting in that position. Associations are one aspect of memory. However, all that has been noted here, and all that follows, belongs to the study of the human machine. This work teaches that we must know human mechanicalness, and then catch glimpses of how it all works in us. When we take ourselves for granted, or take ourselves as one big me, myself or I, every day and always the same, It makes it impossible for us to work on ourselves. We are like a city filled with different people, some of whom are very troublesome as long as we take them as I, and this city is full of used and unused roads. The realization of that does not lead to a loss of feeling of oneself, rather it leads to a loss of the wrong feeling of oneself, or to use a work phrase, we must realize that we are a house in disorder with nobody in charge. Taking lastly the formatory part of intellectual center, its moving part, here lies the memory for words, phrases, all of our ordinary orientations to life, small plans, catching buses or trains, and so on. All these are different memories in subdivisions, occupied by different eyes, that attend to those matters and have been trained to do so. They help us to accomplish our routine and tasks that get us through the workday in an efficient and productive manner. Looking at memory in the higher parts of ordinary centers, and how it differs from memory in smaller parts, or if you prefer memory in bigger eyes in contrast to memory in smaller eyes. In the first place, it is impossible to remember oneself in small eyes, as it is quite simply a waste of time. In fact, it is worse than a waste of time, because it drags the whole of this work down to a very basic level. The work cannot fall on small eyes that are incapable of understand it, eyes that are turned towards life, and so necessary for life skills. If we go about in our daily life, then simply or suddenly try to remember ourselves, because some little parrot eye tells us to do so, perhaps one of those smaller nagging eyes that give an entirely false sense of duty, then quite simply laugh at such nonsense. The act of self-remembering must have a certain emotional quality. It is owing to this emotional quality that one is placed instantly into the higher parts of centers, into bigger eyes. These can remember the work because they can understand it. It's worth noting here that no one can work continuously either, but only at times. It is possible, however, to keep awake a little all of the time, at least enough to be able to observe oneself, because self-observation should accompany our ordinary life, and can do so, but self-remembering is on quite a different level. Self-observation can lead up to self-remembering when one notices that one is forgetting their aim. In self-remembering, all the memory of this work enters, not necessarily consciously, but by a high level of association. Eyes that are in higher parts of centers have a far more comprehensive memory than those of little eyes that stand, as it were, close to the ground and with limited vision. These bigger eyes can take in 2 or 3 things simultaneously and relate them, because they possess wider perspective. That is why the memory of these eyes becomes quite different. They can, as it were, take in the whole of a subject, whereas little eyes can take in only one small part, and for this reason continually argue inside us, catching hold of each contradiction and then disputing it. It is a great misfortune to be judged by other people, by little eyes, and this is after all the general human affliction. We get into bigger eyes, either through an emotional experience, or through attention. Directed attention, which has to deal with work ideas, can place us into an emotional state, even a book or movie that contains B influences. This makes it possible to remember ourselves, because it puts us into a chain of conscious associations, voluntarily acquired, or rather acquired through choice. Here the memory of everything is quite different, because things are in the right order, a place for everything and everything its place. It is a wonderful experience when this begins to happen, when we begin to touch real self-remembering, as described in the verses of Ecclesiastes. If we worry about self-remembering, or do it simply from a sense of duty, then we will not reach that state because we begin from the wrong place. It is the whole feeling of the work that makes it possible to remember oneself. It is the whole memory of this work that enables access. But that memory is not the same as any ordinary memories that we use for run-of-the-mill life, and is like going into another room. If there is nothing there, then there can be no self-remembering in any real sense. If we remember our origin and feel it emotionally enough, we may touch the level of self-remembering and then remember many other things that we have long forgotten. This is special memory, where events, places, and people are joined together by similar emotional states, by a similar taste. Here we often find things that we may have thought to be no good, things we might have tried to do, things we thought we had failed in. We find them there suddenly, in those special memories. You can find nothing there that you thought you did well and deserved credit for. So remember that each center feels, and that every division of a center feels, that all these feelings are of different qualities, and call up their own unique memories. This is why so much insistence is placed upon evaluation of the work, because evaluation is feeling, and it is through feeling this work that we come into contact with eyes in ourselves that can work and self-remember, leading to a state of self-remembering. Feeling for the work develops through sensing when you have wrong feelings about the work. No one can feel rightly, but people can become more conscious of when things are taken incorrectly. Through inner separation, by non-identifying and the dislike of wrong feelings and discomfort about them, it becomes possible for right feelings to enter. When we have experienced a few moments of right feeling, we remember them afterwards in ordinary life, in an inverse manner, through knowing that we have not had the right feelings before. This action of memory is the most interesting of all. If we were not given occasional inner perceptions and experiences a little above our ordinary level, then we could not grow. The point is, we do actually have traces of experience beyond our ordinary level. This is one of the most remarkable things about human existence, and points to our having something more in us than we believe that we have. If we think of the side octave from the sun, we can grasp the explanation and see why, in the work, memory is taken as one of the most important of all things. Why the purification of memory is so important. For to retain the memory of useless things and sustain them is not the right use of memory. Our memory must become selective. P.D. Ouspensky, in speaking of what he would ask for if he had 3 wishes, said, "One thing would be to be able to forget what I would like to forget, and to remember what I want to remember. We forget things by reducing their importance, and we remember things by increasing their importance. Some things we must starve in ourselves, and some we must feed. The work teaches what we have to deny force to, and what we have to nurture. One of the most important ways of altering memory is through cancelling debts, by seeing the unpleasant things we attribute to others as also existing in ourselves. This is one of the great uses of self-observation, and checks the growth of unpleasant memories, which in turn changes us. That kind of work on self is always possible, in any moment wherever we are, and begins as soon as you reach the stage of being able to notice when you're taking in unpleasant impressions, either from outside or from memory.